We often think of the 12 apostles as figures trapped in stained glass windows or static statues in ancient cathedrals, men of mystery who belong to a distant mythical past. But history tells a far more visceral and staggering story. These were not mythical beings. They were real men, fishermen, tax collectors, and political zealots who walked thousands of miles through hostile lands without paved roads, without airplanes, and without any guarantee of safety. They were driven by a fire that the world could not extinguish, fueled by a single command from the lips of the resurrected Christ. You will be my witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and to the ends of the earth. Jerusalem was the epicenter. It was the site of the cross, the empty tomb, and the fiery descent of the Holy Spirit at Pentecost. But for the apostles, Jerusalem was not a destination, it was the starting line. One of the first to give his life was James the Less, the son of Alphaeus. While others prepared for long journeys, James stayed in the shadow of the temple, serving as a pillar of the nascent church in the very city where the revolution began. He did not travel far in distance, but he traveled deep into the heart of the conflict. Tradition tells us he was stoned to death by religious leaders who could not silence his testimony. He was the first to prove that the message of Jesus was worth more than life itself. But while James stayed, others began to move westward. John, the beloved disciple, moved to the strategic city of Ephesus in present-day Turkey, shepherding the growing church across the sea. Unlike his brethren, John would not die by the sword or the stone. Instead, he was exiled to the rocky isolation of the island of Patmos. There, as an old man, he looked into the corridors of heaven and wrote the book of Revelation, witnessing the end of times before closing his eyes in peace. But as John looked toward the future, others were pushing into the deep, dark corners of the present. Jude, Thaddeus, and Simon the Zealot left the comforts of Judea and ventured into the heart of the Persian Empire, what we know today as Iran. These two faithful companions crossed nearly 1,500 kilometers of desert and mountain to reach the city of Susa. They refused to bow to the Persian gods, and for their fidelity, they were brutally executed. Their names may resonate little in modern minds, but their blood etched the gospel into the soil of the East. The map was beginning to bleed and the message was spreading relentlessly. Every step they took was a declaration that the king had returned. Some truths are only revealed to those who dare to leave everything behind. And that moment of total surrender is where faith becomes power. This is the journey of power of faith. If Jerusalem was the spiritual heart of the new movement, Rome was the iron lungs of the world. The Roman Empire was a dark, sprawling machine of power and oppression, and at its center sat the capital, a city of marble, blood, and shadows. To take the gospel to Rome was to walk directly into the mouth of the lion. Two men on our list took this path, but let us look first at Philip. Philip was the connector. From the moment he met Jesus, his first instinct was to bring others to the Messiah. He was the one who stood on the road to Gaza and explained the scrolls of Isaiah to an Ethiopian official, a moment many believe planted the first seeds of Christianity in the continent of Africa. Philip eventually moved north into Asia Minor, settling in Hierapolis in what is now Turkey. He preached with such a contagious fire that even the wife of the Roman governor turned her back on the pagan gods. The cost of this conversion was Philip's life. He was arrested and crucified, his journey covering 1,500 kilometers from the upper room to his final breath in Hierapolis. But the most famous journey toward the heart of the empire belongs to Simon Peter. Peter was never an academic or a politician. He was a rough-handed fisherman from Galilee. He was impulsive, brave, and deeply flawed. The man who walked on water and the man who denied Christ 3 times in a single night. Yet, after being lovingly restored by the resurrected Jesus, this simple fisherman became the natural leader of the revolution. He didn't just stay in the safety of Judea. His calling pushed him further and further into the mouth of the beast. Peter traveled to Antioch and eventually to Rome itself, the very seat of Nero's dark reign. Imagine Peter, the fisherman from a tiny village, standing in the shadows of the Colosseum and the Roman Forum. He wasn't there to build a palace. He was there to plant a kingdom that would outlast the stones of Rome. Under the persecution of Nero, Peter continued to preach the truth until the soldiers came for him. Sentenced to death by crucifixion, Peter made one final staggering request. He claimed he was not worthy to die in the same manner as his Lord, and so, in an act of ultimate humility and defiance against the darkness, he was crucified upside down. Image: a dark, dramatic silhouette of an upside-down cross against a Roman sunset. Today, tradition holds that his remains rest beneath the massive dome of St. Peter's Basilica, built on the very spot where Nero's circus once flowed with the blood of martyrs. Peter's journey was over 4,000 kilometers of wandering, suffering, and preaching. He went from mending nets in Galilee to shaking the foundations of the greatest empire the world had ever known. The fisherman had become a fisher of men on a global scale. But while Peter conquered the West, other apostles were looking toward the mysterious distant horizons of the South and the North. The map was expanding, and the cost of every new territory was the life of the man who carried the light. As the message of the empty tomb radiated outward, it reached men who had once been outcasts in their own society. Consider Matthew, also known as Levi. Before he met Jesus, he was a tax collector, a man viewed by his fellow Jews as a traitor and a collaborator with the Roman oppressors. He was a man of cold mathematics and profit, but when Jesus looked at his heart and said, "Follow me," Matthew left his table of gold and became a collector of souls. After the resurrection, Matthew stayed for a time in Judea, but his calling eventually pulled him south toward the ancient and spiritual kingdom of Ethiopia. Think of the magnitude of this journey. From Jerusalem to Ethiopia is a distance of over 2,500 kilometers. In the first century, this was not a simple trip. It was a grueling, months-long trek on foot, by camel, and by donkey through scorched deserts and unknown territories. Matthew was following the trail blazed by the Ethiopian eunuch, strengthening a nascent Christian community in Africa. The Ethiopian church maintains that Matthew performed a staggering miracle there, resurrecting the son of the king, which led to a massive revival. But the light always stirs the darkness. A pagan faction, desperate to protect their ancient gods, attacked Matthew while he was at prayer, piercing him with a spear. The man who once lived for the coin of Rome died for the glory of Christ, his blood mingling with the red soil of Africa. While Matthew pushed south, Andrew, the very first disciple to follow Jesus, turned his eyes toward the frozen mysteries of the north. Andrew was the one who first told his brother Peter, "We have found the Messiah." That fire of first love took him through Asia Minor and into Greece, but ancient testimonies, especially from the Orthodox tradition, place him venturing far beyond the civilized borders of the Greco-Roman world. Andrew is believed to have crossed into Scythia, a vast wild region encompassing modern-day Ukraine and southern Russia. Image: a lone traveler with a staff walking across a vast wind-swept northern steppe under a grey sky. Andrew traveled over 2,600 kilometers from Jerusalem, preaching to nomadic tribes and facing extreme dangers in the sparsely civilized wilderness. For this reason, he is revered today as the spiritual founder of the church in Eastern Europe. His journey ended back in Greece, in the city of Patras. Like his brother Peter, he faced the cross, but his was an X-shaped cross. Tied, not nailed, to prolong his agony, Andrew spent his final 2 days on earth doing what he had done since the day he met Jesus. He preached to everyone who passed by until his breath failed. We must pause to realize the complete madness of these journeys. These men were traveling distances equivalent to crossing entire continents on foot, driven by nothing but a conviction that they had seen God walk on earth. They didn't have paved roads or GPS. They had a commission and a spirit. But as far as Andrew and Matthew went, there was one apostle who was about to set a record for distance that would leave the ancient world in awe. The map was stretching toward the rising sun, and the man carrying the torch was the one who had once demanded to see the scars. We now turn our gaze toward the most mysterious and distant frontier of the apostolic age, the Far East. To understand this journey, we must look at Thomas, the man forever branded by history as the doubter. Thomas was the one who refused to settle for second-hand faith. He wanted to see the prints of the nails and touch the wound in the side of the Savior. But once Thomas encountered the resurrected Christ, his skepticism didn't turn into mere belief. It turned into an unstoppable, fiery courage. While the other apostles moved through the familiar Mediterranean world, Thomas looked at the horizon and began a journey that would take him 4,000 kilometers away from the streets of Jerusalem. Thomas traveled through Syria into the heart of Persia and finally reached the southwest coast of the Indian subcontinent, the region we now know as Kerala. Imagine the scene. A lone Galilean fisherman standing on the shores of India, thousands of miles from everything he had ever known, carrying a message in a language the locals had never heard. Yet Thomas didn't just survive, he thrived. He founded 7 churches in India, reaching Hindu sages and commoners alike. Even today, nearly 2,000 years later, millions of St. Thomas Christians in India claim to be the direct descendants of those who heard the gospel from the lips of the man who once doubted. But the cost of this spiritual conquest was absolute. In the city of Chennai, on a hill that still bears his name, Thomas was martyred. As he knelt in prayer, he was pierced through by the spears of local soldiers. The man who had demanded to touch the wounds of Jesus now bore the wounds of a martyr in his own flesh. But Thomas was not alone in the East. Bartholomew, one of the most mysterious of the 12, followed a similar path. Often identified as Nathanael, the man Jesus saw under the fig tree, Bartholomew took the message to Armenia and even joined Thomas on the western coast of India. Historians tell us he left behind a copy of the Gospel of Matthew written in Hebrew, a bridge between the world of the prophets and the world of the East. However, Bartholomew's end was perhaps the most horrific of all the apostles. Returning to Armenia, he converted the local king, inciting a demonic rage in the pagan priests. In a display of unimaginable cruelty, he was flayed alive, his skin literally torn from his body while he was still breathing, before being beheaded. Image: a dramatic classical-style painting of an apostle holding a scroll with a faint ghostly outline of a flayed skin behind him. In Christian art, Bartholomew is often depicted holding his own skin, a terrifyingly vivid symbol of a man who gave not just his life, but his very flesh for the truth. When we look at the map, we see Thomas in Chennai and Bartholomew in Armenia, their journeys marking the easternmost borders of the 1st century church. They traveled further than any Roman general, conquered more territory than any earthly king, and they did it with nothing but a staff and a story. But even as the East was being claimed, one final apostle was looking toward the literal end of the world in the West. The map was almost complete, and the first to be called was about to become the first to shed his blood. As we trace the final lines on this map of sacrifice, we must travel to what the ancient world called Finisterre, the end of the earth. Here we find James the Greater, the son of Zebedee and brother of John. James was part of the inner circle, one of the few who stood on the Mount of Transfiguration and walked into the deep shadows of Gethsemane with Jesus. He was a son of thunder, a man of fierce intensity. According to a powerful and ancient tradition, that intensity drove him further west than any other of the original 12, all the way to the Iberian Peninsula, to the rugged coast of Galicia in present-day Spain. Crossing pagan lands and hostile seas, James carried the light to the very edge of the Atlantic Ocean. Though his mission in Spain was difficult and his converts were few at the time, he planted a seed that would eventually transform Europe. But the path of the apostle always leads back to the cross. James returned to Jerusalem, and there his journey became a full circle. In the year 44 AD, the book of Acts records that King Herod Agrippa killed James, the brother of John, with the sword. He was the first of the original 12 to be martyred. The first to see the risen Lord was now the first to join him in glory. Image: a heavy iron sword resting on a stone floor, illuminated by a single shaft of light in a dark prison cell. We look at this map today and we see a world transformed. From the rainy cliffs of Spain to the humid shores of India, from the frozen steppes of Scythia to the ancient heights of Ethiopia, the blood of these 11 men became the seed of a global church. They were not kings, they were not soldiers, and they had no earthly power. They were simply men who had seen something so real, so world-shaking, that they could not stay silent. They traveled over 30,000 combined kilometers on foot and by boat to tell a dying world that death had been defeated. But there is one more man. A man who was not in the upper room, but who encountered the king on a dusty road to Damascus, Paul of Tarsus. If the apostles planted the seeds, Paul was the one who set the world on fire, traveling further and writing more than all the rest. His story is so vast, it requires a map of its own. The journeys of the apostles prove that the gospel is not a local philosophy. It is a global rescue mission. These men didn't die for a tradition or a theory. They died for a person, and that same person is calling you today. You don't have to travel to India or Spain to find him. He is as close as your next breath. The map of the apostles ended in martyrdom, but it opened a way for the entire world to come home. The question is, where will your journey take you? This is the legacy of the witnesses. This is power of faith.